Greetings. Welcome to Change the World. My name's Guy Dauncey, and this is the show where we like to meet people who are doing really bright stuff for the planet, who are visionary, who are positive, thinking about solutions. And our guest today is Briony Penn, a naturalist, writer, and much-loved broadcaster who lives on Salt Spring Island. She's well known for her tireless devotion to protect endangered species and sensitive ecosystems. Briony is the author of 5 books, including her most recent called Following the Good River, The Life and Times of Warhaid, who's a Kitlake First Nations leader. But today we're talking about a different book, which is Briony's newish book, A Year on the Wild Side, a West Coast Naturalist's Almanac, which is essays that Briony wrote over a 20-year period for a month, just about her personal interactions and experience with nature. And I can tell you, as a writer, I am really envious of the way in which Briony has such a natural ease with her prose. She has such fun with the words, with her experience. She weaves it all together, makes me sigh with envy. Oh my God, this is what a real writer is like. So Briony, before we jump into your book, tell us a little about how you came to write these things and how life is on Salt Spring.
Oh, well, hi, Guy. Thanks for the introduction. And so the idea for the column started actually, and I describe it in the book, when I was 9 months pregnant with my very first boy. And I was scrounging around trying to save the oaks. And it actually started in a ditch in the middle of the night because I was trying to post up some signs saying save the oaks. And from that, I started to write. I don't know. I decided to write a letter into the editor, and that editor turned into a column, and the column went on. And I've actually been writing columns now since from 1991 until just recently. I just took a sabbatical for the first time this year.
And you still enjoy it as much as it's clearly evident that you did when you wrote all these?
I love it. I love writing. I feel like this was my therapy through a long raising children.
So one of the delightful things about this book is Briony is also a great artist, and every story has got illustrations. So let's jump right in with your story about the Douglas fir.
Well, the Douglas fir, if you look at the image, you can see the tree, and there's a little fellow standing there, which was Merv Wilkinson, who is a wonderful, past now, but a wonderful legend, really, in Vancouver Island for his love and his knowledge about forestry. And the story itself actually doesn't necessarily involve Merv, but that was in tribute to him. The story started because I was sitting there one day. I was wearing a black dress that was made out of wood chips, rayon, and this fir came down in a big storm, and I realized, the sense of this big tree coming down, all the history of it. And so it sort of started me rambling about ideas about, kind of our interconnectedness. And then I kind of started thinking about David Bohm's, the physicist's concept of how all energy flows through a seed and ends up, and we're all connected. My little black dress, the tree, myself, all the creatures that have lived on it. Yeah. So that's how the Douglas fir story started.
Let's go from the Douglas fir. Anyone who wanders in the forest on Vancouver Island, if you look up, you see the fir trees. If you look down, you see the moss. So yes. Then you've got a story about moss. I just love the different mosses.
Well, the moss story started because, if nothing else, if you've got nothing else to look at and you're wanting to go out and wander in the forest, moss is always there. It doesn't move. And I was trying to think of a way to really get people excited about moss. So I had been watching an edition of Sex and the City with one of my young, the daughters of a friend. And I was trying to think, I said, you guys, Sex and the City just doesn't have it. I mean, like, it's way better go and have some love in the forest, because you got these beautiful mossy bowers. And I was trying to think of ways in which young people would connect to the natural world. So that's where Sex and the City, Love in the Forest story came from. And it was about these mossy bowers.
I must admit, when I wander in the forest locally, I just started it this year, started looking more closely at the moss instead of it seeing a just bank of green stuff. And I think I counted up to 20 different species of moss, but I haven't got to know all the names yet.
Well, I mean, it's just like this beautiful world in itself. And when I was little, I would make little moss gardens. I was very influenced
Yeah.
by people out. So yeah,
Yeah.
moss is a wonderful place to start.
So staying in the forest, let's move to the barred owl.
Yeah, ho 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 ho. This
Ah,
hook's for you. So, I try to start where people are at, and often I get phoned up, and people say, "What was that crazy noise I heard in the forest the other night?" And inevitably, it'll have been a barred owl because they are incredibly vocal, and especially around their mating time. So this story was really to kind of hook people in with what they may have heard, and then kind of talk about the species because it's actually new to the West Coast, and it's had actually an impact on our smaller owls, but also to kind of create the map. People are love owls. I mean, Harry Potter, I think at the time when I wrote this, Harry Potter was coming out. So that's another great way of hooking people into the local wildlife, is to actually talk about the things that they might be seeing. And barred owls are very present in our urban areas. They're very
and,
well adapted.
and when you see one sitting on a tree, calmly staring at you, you think, "Oh my goodness, there's a presence here," right?
Yeah, people actually, they're like spiritual experiences. They really feel they've connected with something wild, and I think that's where we really need to encourage people to try and connect to the wild right now, because it's really good for your soul. It's really good for your health. Those meaningful encounters with something like a barred owl can lead to a wider and longer relationship with the
Yeah.
natural world.
So staying in the forest, arbutus berries. You got a story about actually scattering the arbutus tree. We all love the arbutus tree, but you talked about the berries in a way I hadn't thought about before.
Well, this really came about because sometimes we're so full of grief and we don't know what we can do. And my grief is really about the loss of the natural world, about the impacts of climate change, and all the inequities and injustices of big corporate powers. And so I learned this from a friend of mine who was doing the same thing in Scotland. When he felt frustrated, he would gather a big handful of birch and then throw the seeds into areas that were really ugly, and he would call it birchatage. And so I called it arbutage, and it actually really works because arbutus is a very good pioneer species. It'll grow on gravel. And I always used to look at these beautiful arbutus growing out of the like craziest concrete, sort of ugly places, sort of around ferry terminals or something, where it was the only thing that could survive this sort of industrialized landscape. And that was just because birds were probably pooping there. But so I thought, well, I'm just going to take that idea and get rid of my grief by doing some positive action. So I really encourage people to do arbutage. It's very therapeutic.
You haven't explained what arbutage is yet, then.
Well, it's taking berries, and you can prepare them by pouring boiling water and mushing them up in a pulverizer. But it's literally throwing seeds into areas that you want to beautify.
So right now we're doing this interview in December when the arbutus seeds are all berries are all on the ground.
Perfect
But
time.
but you're saying that to boil them up is the equivalent of putting them through the gut of a bird, which is the
That's correct.
normal way in which they'd be inseminated, right?
Yes, that's how they
Germinated.
move around. The big, beautiful band-tailed pigeons love eating these berries, and they'll come along.
So if you see arbutus berries lying on the ground, take them home, literally pour boiling water on them, mush them up, and then go and scatter them. Brilliant.
Yeah, yeah, and all those
So
ugly malls. You know those malls where they just stretch for miles?
yes,
Go
yes.
and find a little tiny crack and
Oh
and
right.
arbutage those
Place
malls.
it there carefully. Brilliant. So moving on to another tree, the maple tree and its leaves. You have thoughts about maple leaves.
Well, the maple leaves, I love the big leaf maples. Like growing up on the West Coast, everybody knows and loves those huge, big maple leaves. And I remember when I first met the first person that said, "Oh, I hate these leaves. I'm always having to sort of, you know, get out my leaf blowing machine and do something to it." And so this was a tribute to leaves, and it's called Leave the Leaves. And it's about why these leaves are so important to the coast and why they enrich our soil and they enrich our lives and they enrich children's play and they enrich habitat. And so if I've nothing else, I want to convince at least one person who doesn't like leaves to leave their leaves and throw their leaf blower out.
So every year we gather up leaves and put them into a sort of container and then use them for mulch on the soil the next year on our garden.
Oh, well, that's fine. That's
Yeah.
absolutely fine. I'm just
But
saying,
I
don't
came, go on.
don't use those leaf blowers and then just send them away in some plastic
Well,
garbage
well,
bag.
well, viewers, you're now going to watch Brownie have a fit because from what I tell her now, I saw her maybe the other day burning all her leaves.
Ah, yeah, I know. Don't. All those emissions, you're contributing to climate change. So it's really about how do we get people in love with these things. And
Yeah.
part of it for me was that I grew up as a child playing in leaves, making castles out of leaves, discovering little things crawling under the leaves. Like they're beautiful trees, they're beautiful leaves, and they give us so much pleasure.
Yeah.
And in the Sanchoffin language, which is the language of this, the Sandwich Peninsula and the Gulf Islands and the South Gulf Islands, the time of October was the time of the golden leaves, the month, the moon of the golden leaves.
Brilliant.
And we need to re-enchant ourselves with our local trees.
So from October, we're going to do a jump into May or late April and the camas flower. And then you've got a little thing to say around lawns tied up with all this one.
Ah, well, camas. I grew up in camas meadows and not really understanding that these were just untended gardens that had been left untended because of colonization and the most egregious effects of genocide. These were the gardens that were tended by Wasanage women who were cultivating the bulbs as roots that were the main carbohydrate staple crop. So in my story on camas, I'm really trying to re-enchant people with what a beautiful flower they are. And they're lily. If the camas had come from Scotland, or the Royal Horticultural Society, then all these gardening types would be all over them. But because they're a native plant, they somehow aren't imbued with some sort of European blessing. And so we ignore them. We plow them up. We mow them. We don't celebrate them. And so the camas now, these big, beautiful camas beds that you can still see at Beacon Hill and Uplands Park, have just been obliterated under lawns, daffodils. Like, why do we not celebrate our beautiful wildflower meadows? I just don't get it.
So
And
up, here-
so,
up here in Yellow Point, where I live, we had the entrance to Yellow Point Park. There was a great mass of broom, and just one neighbor systematically started clearing the broom, and then we, as members of the Yellow Point Ecological Society, started working with her. And it is a sea of camas every spring. It's a massive sea of camas now.
oh, well, and those are the things. So I think that everybody can really make this, especially in this time of COVID, is ecological restoration is such a meaningful activity. There's all sorts of organizations you can join, all the land trusts, like the Yellow Point Ecological Society. There's lots of people doing this ecological work, and it is so rewarding because you stop mowing your lawn, or you cut back the Scottish broom and the English ivy, and then these beautiful meadows appear. And it's also something to do that we can do for reconciliation, because these are these are the gardens that were cultivated by and can continue to be cultivated by First Nations.
Yeah.
And these are essential for their health. They're very special foods that people have grown up with, and people like
Yeah.
Cheryl Bryce are really bringing a renaissance of some of these traditional
So,
foods back to the islands.
so the camas need the bees, and you've got a wonderful story on the pollen bees.
Well, I'm a big proponent of native bees. We don't need honeybees as much as we need our native bees. And so you'll see in this story, this is really kind of a story of how it starts off with my youngest son loving these kind of awful, cereals with this kind of cartoon bee on it.
Yeah.
And I felt so compromised as a mother. I was like, oh, I shouldn't be feeding my child this bee food. But it's just kind of a pun on motherhood and the difficulties of, facing corporatization and globalization. But really, so it was a discovery backwards about what we've lost in terms of not only our native foods, our local foods, but our local bees.
And I think you said we have 40 species of native bee on the island.
Well, there's 35, 35, maybe there's 40. I don't think there's 40, but I think there's 35, and they range from the bumblebees and the very special Western bumblebee that's almost been pushed into extirpation. There's the miner's bees, there's the orchard mason bees, there's the little carpenter bees, there's those little sweat bees that hover and sit on your cheeks when they're glistening.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Cool.
and there's some little tips on how you can encourage your bees.
Make a little mason bee box. So
Yeah.
staying in the air, we'll move to the purple martin.
Well, yeah, so purple martins, this story starts because I was out with a friend of mine, Trudy Chatwin, who's an amazing biologist and endangered species specialist. And we were out checking these purple martin boxes as part of a project to try and bring back the purple martin, because they had almost been extirpated on Vancouver Island and the islands. And while we were out there, we had to the tide was coming up very quickly, so we had just stripped off in order to try and get up to the nest boxes and measure the young ones and do an inventory on them. When suddenly we realized we were being watched by the one of the conservation officers who thought we were out there, doing something bad to the purple martins, and we were naked. So it was the story. It's just the extent to which you have to do things. I mean, it's crazy things, but also just the fun and the joy of working with, working on some of these projects. It's all citizen science. It's just working as volunteers, trying to help. And the nest box revitalization project for purple martins has been phenomenal. They went down to, just a handful of pairs, and now there's hundreds and hundreds of purple martins all up and down the coast. Wherever these purple martin boxes have been built on piers over the water, their populations have come back.
That's brilliant. Are they mainly around the sea, or are they around lakes as well?
Well, these ones are, have been primarily, there's different purple martins. There's the sort of continental purple martin, which has adapted to lakes and freshwaters, and these are our very special coastal purple martins. Okay. So they're adapted to the seawater.
So let's move from the air down to the ground and our lakes and wetlands and the amphibians.
I'm a little bit obsessed by newts, so that usually tells you something about who I am. I've loved newts. They're so beautiful when you see them and you hold them in your hands, which isn't such a great idea because they've got huge doses of neurotoxins in their skin. And so they're not great to touch, but they are an amazing indicator. And every March and September they cross, because they mate in the ponds. They cross roads and you see them squished. And I have this like obsessive desire to try and get people to slow down in the wet evenings of spring and autumn. And so part of the story of the newt is about, being careful if you're driving around in the spring and autumn on wet nights. And then the other story about them is really a children's nursery rhyme. It's kind of a goofy take on One Little Piggy Went to Market. It's like one little tree frog went to the pond.
Yes, and I didn't realize recently till we had a presentation by Elke Wind that they migrate inland to their, a new word, hibernaculums.
That's right. Oh, that's the western toad especially. And they'll often go and snuggle out with little voles or something. So there's so much. Honestly, these animals are so interesting. They are so beautiful. I mean, Cecil Paul Wahed, who I've just worked on 2 books, and sadly he's passed away in the last yesterday. So it's It's a really emotional time for me. But
Mm,
in Kanakshla culture, the frogs are so sacred that in their rituals of frog, they inevitably die because they've committed such an act.
mm.
These amphibians are so important to us in so many ways, and I just was trying to find ways into to connect somehow Western culture with why amphibians are important, because we don't have that place for them. We talk about, you know, little
Yeah.
Bo Peep and her sheep, but we don't talk about how important amphibians are.
And if you just go down to any wetland or lake and just sit there for a while, you'll see them, right?
If you have a healthy wetland, you'll see them.
Yeah.
If you don't see them, then you know it's not healthy, and that
Yeah. Okay.
should give big alarm bells that go off in your
Yeah.
because and if they're not there, then you should be working hard to figure out why that wetland isn't healthy,
Cool.
because
So
if it isn't healthy, you're not healthy.
staying with water, river otters come next, not sea otters, but river otters.
Well, the river otter story started when I met a young German woman who was describing this incredible sculpture that had happened on the town halls of her town in Germany. And it was where someone had dumped 1,000 rocks, and that they all had for every and they blocked the town hall, and they couldn't get into the town hall until they'd removed every rock and planted a tree.
This
And
was
that was
kind of creative, artistic anarchism, right?
it was artistic anarchism, and I thought, oh, that's fantastic. And so it made me think that river otters live in these kind of beautiful holts, which is another name for their home. And they're like everywhere. They're hounded out in urban areas, whether it's just their loss of their habitat, the loss of their food, just being hounded out by dogs or people or whatever. And so I thought, we should be dumping 1,000 rocks onto the legislature and demanding that, we could call it 1,000 otters, or we could call it, you know whatever, some way of and the idea of using art and activism as a way to just get people to think that about,
Yeah.
species other than
And
ourselves.
so in Germany, each time the city planted a tree, the artist removed one of the rocks, and he got a
That
thousand trees planted.
That's correct. And the Schlossmeister or whatever was able to actually get in through the door and get to his job.
Cute. So let's
Very
go from the otters right into the ocean and the sea stars.
well. Everybody will have felt the loss of the sea stars when the big mass wasting syndrome happened in 2013. And I
Yeah.
originally wrote this article before the mass wasting syndrome, and then so this was kind of like a celebration of sea stars as they come back to life and why they fill our lives with so much beauty. I mean, we use them in every tourist brochure, for the coast. So, yeah, that was
And it's
one of
true
those.
about what 3 or 4 years ago, they just sort of melted and disintegrated and all fell apart because of this sea star wasting syndrome, which I believe is partly fungus, but partly caused by warming oceans and therefore by climate crisis.
Yes, they're all related, obviously. You're going to get higher degrees of toxicity in warmer waters because you've got
Yeah.
more bacterial growth and all that sort of thing, and
And
viral.
they are making a recovery of sorts.
They are, and they're resilient because we're discovering the ones that survive or have got, a genetic,
Yeah. So
selection
let's
for.
so let's stay on the ocean bottom and go to the eelgrass
Well,
and the
eelgrass, it's
herrings.
the eelgrass and herring. Herring, what people don't realize is that herring is actually the most important fish on the entire coast. People think of them as salmon, but actually the herring is what kept people alive all through the winter and the early spring runs for millennia. And we have wiped out the herring. And fisheries and oceans have a lot to answer for that. They continue to fish them down. So this story was really to try and kind of enchant people about herring. People sort of say, why do you want to, why, who cares about herring? Don't we just eat them? Um, so this story is really about enchantment in the
So,
eelgrass meadows.
and the herring are the primary food of the salmon, if I'm right.
They're the primary food of the Chinook salmon, and the which is the primary food of the Chinook are the primary food of our southern residents. Without herring, we have no Chinook. Without Chinook, we
Yeah.
have no
So
orca.
we just got 3 minutes left. So let's go to frilled anemones.
Well, this was my rant. I decided to write a letter to a corporate leader and use the frilled anemones to as my kind of metaphor. And I love this story because every time I'm feeling sad and just frustrated with just kind of corporate inaction, I dream about sending this letter to the heads of, the pipelines and the coal mines and the
Yeah.
LNG mines, and it just makes me laugh. And it's all about using corporate language in the metaphor of the intertidal zone because it's such a crazy zone. It's very competitive. And I feel that if corporate owners could spend more time in the intertidal zone and less time in their boardrooms, this would be a better world.
So that's great. So I'm rushing through this. So one more. Let's wrap up on the humpback whales and the how you called the albatross.
Well, this is a story, and I'm glad you're ending with this one because this is really about magic, about when you get out in the natural world and you just observe. Magic things always kind of happen. It's the synchronicity of being out there. You can sometimes just call up things. If you call things up and you're in good heart and good spirit, they will appear for you. And almost all my life, and I've really learned this from Cecil Paul Walcade, is that we are all brothers and sisters, and when you call things up because you are wanting to see them and you're thinking about how are they doing today, they will suddenly appear, and that's
And so,
what gives
and
you
so
so much
Briony, you
meaning.
were on this boat out on the ocean off Haida Gwaii, and you were at the prow of the boat, and you read the rhyme of the ancient mariner, and the albatross appeared.
Yes, and that often happens. That's what's called summoning up. When you just
Yeah.
summon up animals by reading things or summoning them up just by name. And this beautiful albatross came just out of the mist. And I don't if anyone's ever seen albatross, they'll never forget it because they look like these huge big 2x10s flying in the air. They're just so huge and straight wings. They're just
So
incredible.
So, Briony, this has been a fantastic time. As far as I'm concerned, the universe summoned up you to come and help us and inspire us at this time of great crisis for nature and for biodiversity. So, viewers, this is Briony's book, A Year on the Wild Side, a West Coast Naturalist's Almanac. She's got 120 stories like this in it. It's in your bookshops. You can get it elsewhere. Do get yourself a copy. Buy a copy for your friends. Treat yourself to this because as I said earlier, the way you write, Briony, is just a delight.
Well, thanks, Guy, and thanks for the opportunity. And I hope people will write their own stories, which is I'd really love to do it. There's a Vancouver Island College course, which is really encouraging people to write their own stories, and that's what I'm wishing is that we all start
Thanks.
rewriting our own stories.
And you can find more on Briony's website. My guest has been Briony Penn. My name's Guy Dauncey. This has been Change the World on Shore TV and Spotlight. Tune in next week for another fascinating story just like this. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.